years, the January 6th insurrection on the Capitol. I'd like to start with a video on the aftermath of January 6th and the threat of domestic terrorism in America.
Multiple capital injury! Multiple capital injury! They're throwing metal poles at us. You give me yourself! You're now! To yourself! They're trying to slow explosives. Weapon injury!
January 6th was a disgrace. There's no question. President Trump is practically and morally responsible for provoking the events of the day.
Violence is never a legitimate form of protest. The president bears responsibility for Wednesday's attack on Congress by mob rioters.
A year after January 6th, are the guardrails that protect democracy real or illusionary?
January 6th laid bare the threat of white nationalism and served as a wake-up call to the intelligence community and the country.
January 6th is a symptom of a deeper problem.
Across the country, election officials and election workers, airline flight crews, school personnel, journalists, U.S. senators and representatives, and judges, prosecutors, and police officers have been threatened and or attacked.
Federal prosecutors have charged a member of the Boogaloo Boys.
Fired 13 rounds into the police department's 3rd Precinct building.
According to an unclassified summary of the March intelligence assessment, the two most lethal elements of the domestic violence extremist threat are racially or ethnically motivated violent extremists and militia violent extremists.
Proud Boys coordinating, instigating, and leading some of the most pivotal moments of the rush into the historic building.
Oath keepers in battle gear in a stacked military formation, methodically working through the crowd, up the Capitol steps.
The Department of Homeland Security itself, in their annual threat assessment in October 2020, declared domestic violent extremism in general, and white supremacist extremism in particular, to be the most persistent and lethal threat facing the nation.
Acts of violence like the El Paso shooting or the Oklahoma City bombing are meant to be political and ideological actions that bring other activists into the movement.
I think it's time to take a hard look at where we're putting our resources.
We can never again allow democracy to be put in peril. Steps should be taken to prevent such an attack on our democracy from ever happening again.
Those of us who were here will never forget the horrifying images of January 6, 2021. A noose and gallows erected on the Capitol lawn. Rioters attacking police officers with flagpoles bearing the American flag. A Confederate battle flag. Confederate battle flag waving in the temple of our democracy, a sight unimaginable even during the darkest days of the Civil War. The insurrection should be a wake-up call, a reminder that America is still confronted with the age-old menace that's taken on a new life in the 21st century, terror from white supremacists, militia members, and other extremists who use violence to further their twisted agenda. Last March, FBI Director Wray told this committee that the threat of domestic terrorism is, quote, metastasizing across the country and not going away anytime soon. In the hours immediately following the insurrection, I was hopeful. When the mob had dispersed and the Senate returned to the Capitol to certify the results of the 2020 election, we, Republicans and Democrats alike, were united. We were determined to show that mob that they had lost and democracy had won. All of us were well aware of who was behind the insurrection. As we saw in the video, Republican congressional leaders like Senator McConnell and Congressman McCarthy joined Democrats in acknowledging that President Trump was, quote, practically and morally responsible for provoking the events of that day. But days turned into weeks, and this solid bipartisan rhetoric was shaken. Our efforts to investigate the insurrection and the former president's attempts to overturn the election were stonewalled. Last May, Senate Republicans filibustered a plan to create an independent bipartisan commission to investigate what happened on January 6th and to make sure it never happened again. And a number of elected Republicans who either refused to repudiate the big lie or have outright endorsed it is growing. Whether the boosters of the big lie know it or not, they're playing with fire. By supporting the false narrative that the 2020 election was somehow stolen or rigged, they have rationalized the worst assault on our capital since the War of 1812. And in turn, they are normalizing the use of violence to achieve political goals. The intelligence community warns us. Narratives of fraud in the recent general election will almost certainly spur domestic violent extremists to try to engage in violence. Congress, this is how democracies die. Today, more than half of Republican voters, more than half, believe the insurrectionists were, quote, protecting democracy. And a recent study from the University of Chicago, Professor Robert Pape, found that nearly 1 in 10 Americans believe that, quote, the use of force is justified to restore Donald J. Trump to the presidency. 1 in 10. These radical viewpoints don't appear out of thin air. Donald Trump continues to spew these divisive, dangerous ideas from his exile in Mar-a-Lago, and his calls have been echoed by a vocal faction of Republican lawmakers who are actively encouraging their supporters to treat political opponents as hostile adversaries. Other Republican lawmakers have remained silent, refusing to condemn them. For example, last year, a Republican congressman tweeted out an animated video showing himself murdering one of his Democratic colleagues. Another House Republican has expressed support for a, quote, national divorce between red and blue states. I might remind this congressman that the last national divorce, our Civil War, cost more American lives than any conflict before or since. Some may wave this incendiary rhetoric off as political bluster or just a bad joke, but the reality is more troubling. These tacit and even explicit endorsements of violence are taking a tragic toll. Over the past 2 years, our nation's public servants have faced a wave of violence. One survey found that nearly 1 in 5 local elected officials has been threatened with violence because of their work in the 2020 election cycle. We've seen an appalling rise in violent outbursts on airplanes, in school board meetings, and in other spheres of public life. We've seen unacceptable, even deadly cases of violence towards law enforcement officers. Don't tell me that you stand for law and order and turn your back on the threats that law enforcement officers are facing every single day. So at the outset of today's hearing, I'd like to respectfully request that every member of this committee use this hearing to explicitly condemn the use or threat of violence to advance political goals. It's a simple request, but sadly a necessary one. This committee should speak with a unified voice in saying violence is unacceptable. This is not an issue of where you stand on the political spectrum. Violent extremism exists on both ends, and whether an act of violence is being committed by a white supremacist in the Capitol or a far-left extremist at a riot in Portland, it is unacceptable and inexcusable, period. We also need to understand the nature of the threat. As senior law enforcement and intelligence officials have warned us, the biggest domestic terrorism threat today stems from white supremacists and violent militia extremists, some of whom are working in America to topple our democracy. For them, January 6th was a test run, and in the year following the insurrection, there have been far too many instances of violent extremism. For example, last month, one domestic terrorist who espoused a variety of far-right fringe and misogynistic views on social media committed a mass shooting in Colorado. The attacker had been on the radar of local law enforcement for years, even listed the names of his victims in self-published books, but unfortunately, no action was taken. He ended up killing 5 people. Before he had a chance to kill more, a heroic police officer, Agent Ashley Ferris, came to the rescue. She arrived on the scene and ordered the attacker to drop his weapon. He responded by shooting her in the stomach. While wounded and bleeding on the ground, Agent Ferris returned fire and brought the attack to an end. Officers like Agent Ferris put their lives on the line every day to defend us. And as we saw on January 6th at the Capitol and in the streets of American cities in 2020, they are too often themselves the target of violent extremism. They cannot take on the biggest threat on our national security alone. They need our help at the federal level, analyzing and acting on intelligence on domestic terror sources. That's why I proposed the Domestic Terrorism Prevention Act, introduced it in 2017. It ensures state and local law enforcement have the resources and data to prevent acts of domestic terror and white supremacist violence. Make sure that law enforcement officials have the resources they need. During today's hearings, I hope we'll learn what steps the Justice Department and FBI are taking to keep our communities, our country, and officers like Agent Ferris safe. I hope this committee will be unequivocal in condemning violence wherever it's sourced on the political spectrum. No more cowering before any mob. Our democracy is in the crosshairs of domestic terrorism. It's time to take a stand. The only way to prevent a recurrence of a deadly insurrection like January 6th is by joining together in defense of our Constitution and the rule of law. With that, I'll turn to my friend.